The front door of Linda Gaines's house in Lexington, Kentucky, looked like every other door on the street. Pale blue paint, a small wreath, a welcome mat that had seen better days. She almost didn't answer it. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November 2021. Cold, the kind of gray that settles into your bones. Linda had been sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at nothing in particular, the way she always did in November, the way she had done every November for 34 years. She wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again, harder this time. Linda set down her cup, walked to the door, put her hand on the knob, and opened it. Standing on her porch was a young woman she had never seen before in her life. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Dark coat, no smile, just standing there, completely still, like she had been rehearsing this moment for a long time. Linda was about to say, "Can I help you?" The polite, automatic thing you say to a stranger at your door. She didn't get the words out, because she saw the eyes, and something in Linda Gaines's chest cracked open like it had been waiting 34 years for permission. She knew those eyes. She had spent 3 decades trying to forget them. They weren't her eyes, they weren't her face. But they were unmistakable in the way that certain things are unmistakable. A voice, a smell, a pair of eyes that belonged to someone who destroyed your life before you were old enough to understand what destruction was. They were Kevin Whitmore's eyes. Linda didn't move, didn't speak. The young woman on the porch spoke first. "My name is Claire Aldrich," she said, "and I think you've been lied to for a very long time." What happened next would expose a pastor who had built his reputation on the Word of God, a cover-up that had been carefully maintained for over 3 decades, a pattern that, it would turn out, did not begin and end with Linda Gaines. But we need to go back, because to understand what happened on that porch in November 2021, you need to understand what happened in Harlan County, Kentucky in the summer of 1987. By 2021, Pastor Kevin Whitmore was exactly the kind of man his father had always wanted him to be. His church, Grace Covenant Fellowship, just outside of Kingsport, Tennessee, seated 1,200 people on a good Sunday. And most Sundays were good. He had the kind of presence that fills a room without trying. Deep voice, easy smile, the sort of man who remembers your name, your wife's name, your kids' names, and asks about all of them in the right order. Local television had featured him twice in the past 5 years. Once for a food drive that collected over 40,000 pounds of donations. Once for an addiction recovery program his church had funded out of pocket. People in Kingsport trusted Kevin Whitmore the way they trusted the weather forecast and their own fathers. Completely and without thinking too hard about it. He had been married to his wife, Donna, for 29 years. They had 3 children. The oldest was in medical school. The youngest had just gotten engaged. At Kevin's anniversary sermon the previous spring, Donna had stood up in front of the congregation and said her husband was the most honest man she had ever known. The congregation had applauded. Kevin had smiled. There was one story Kevin told when the moment felt right. Usually late at night, after a counseling session with a young man who had made mistakes, or quietly, one-on-one, with someone carrying guilt they couldn't put down. He told it carefully, with just enough pain in his voice to make it land. When he was young, he said, he had loved a girl. They had been foolish. She had gotten pregnant. And then, God's will, mysterious and cruel, she had died in childbirth. The baby, too. He had carried that grief for decades. It had shaped him, he said. It had driven him toward God, toward service, toward a life of meaning. It was the kind of story that made people trust a man completely. There is only one problem with that story. Linda Gaines did not die in childbirth. She was, in November 2021, 53 years old. She had worked as a registered nurse at the University of Kentucky Medical Center for 19 years. She had raised 2 sons, attended their graduations, danced at one of their weddings. She had a house with a pale blue door and a welcome mat that had seen better days. She was, by every measurable account, alive. And Kevin Whitmore had always known that. This was not the lie of a frightened young man who panicked and never corrected the record. This was something more deliberate, more constructed. Over the years, at least 4 people in Harlan County had known the truth, known that Linda had survived, that she had left, that she had built a life somewhere else. Each of them had stayed quiet. One had moved away, one had died. 2 were still there, in that same small town, and had not said a word in 34 years. When you build a lie that holds for 3 decades, you don't do it alone. Kevin Whitmore had not done it alone. But the architecture of that lie, who built it, who maintained it, and what it had been designed to protect, that story begins not with Kevin. It begins with his father. Harlan County, Kentucky, in the summer of 1987, was the kind of place that didn't offer many ways out. The coal mines were still running, but barely. Half the storefronts on Main Street had paper in the windows. The families who had money had always had it, and the families who didn't had learned, generation by generation, to make their peace with that fact. You went to church, you kept your head down, you didn't make trouble for people who could make more trouble for you. Linda Gaines had grown up understanding all of this without anyone ever having to explain it. Her father worked a loader at the Darby Creek mine. Her mother cleaned houses 3 days a week. They were not unhappy people, but they were careful people. The kind of careful that comes from knowing exactly how little margin you have. Linda was the exception in her family in one specific way. She was going to leave. Not out of resentment. She loved her parents, loved the hills, loved the particular way the light fell on the county road in October. But she had a plan. Nursing school in Lexington. A scholarship application she had been working on since junior year. A future that existed somewhere beyond the county line. She was 19 years old, and the plan was still intact, and then it wasn't. Kevin Whitmore was 21. He had his father's build and his father's voice, and it would turn out his father's instinct for self-preservation. Pastor Gerald Whitmore ran the largest congregation in the county. He also ran, in the way that certain men in small towns run things without any official title, a considerable amount of everything else. He knew which businesses needed permits and which inspectors could be reasoned with. He knew which families were behind on their bank loans and which loan officers attended his Sunday service. He was not a corrupt man in any dramatic sense. He was simply a man who had spent 40 years making himself indispensable, and who understood, with quiet precision, the difference between people who mattered and people who didn't. Linda Gaines's family did not matter. Gerald Whitmore had known that before Kevin ever said a word to him. Linda told Kevin on a Thursday evening in July. They were sitting in his truck, parked off Route 119. She had been rehearsing the words for 2 weeks. Kevin didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said he needed to think. That night, he told his father. The next morning, Pastor Gerald Whitmore knocked on the door of the Gaines house at 8:45 a.m. Linda's mother answered. Gerald said he'd like to come in. He came in. He sat down at the kitchen table. Linda was sent to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed and listened to the sound of voices she couldn't quite make out. For 45 minutes, her father's voice wasn't among them. He had already left for the mine. When Gerald finally stood to leave, Linda heard her mother walk him to the door. She heard the door open. She heard Gerald say quietly, "You're doing the right thing, Carol, for everyone." Then the door closed. Her mother came to her room. She didn't sit down. She stood in the doorway and looked at Linda with an expression Linda had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not sadness, something flatter than both of those things. And she said, "You're going to sign some papers, and then this is over." Linda signed the papers 8 days later, in a small office above a hardware store on Clement Street. The man who put them in front of her was an attorney named Hargrove. He worked, Linda would later understand, almost exclusively for Gerald Whitmore. She asked for a copy of what she was signing. Hargrove looked at her with patient, practiced calm and explained that copies would be filed with the appropriate offices and that this was standard procedure, and that everything was being handled correctly. Linda was 19 years old. She was sitting across from a man in a suit, in an office she had never been in before, signing documents she didn't fully understand, and somewhere in the county, Kevin Whitmore was not present, had not been present for any of this, and had not called her once since the night she told him. She signed. She did not get a copy. She saw Kevin one more time before she left Harlan County. It was a Saturday morning in late August. She was walking to the pharmacy on Main Street. He was coming out of the hardware store across the road. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then he turned and walked in the other direction. Linda stood on the sidewalk and watched him go. She didn't call after him. There was nothing to call after him about. Everything had already been decided by people who hadn't asked her permission. She left for Lexington 6 weeks later. She never went back. The baby was born on a Wednesday morning in early April 1988 at Harlan ARH Hospital. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, a girl. Linda held her for 4 minutes. She counted. She didn't mean to count. But some part of her brain, the part that was still functioning like a human being while the rest of her was somewhere far away, registered the time. 4 minutes. The nurse who took the baby was not unkind. She didn't say anything. She just lifted her, gently, and carried her out of the room. Linda stared at the ceiling for a long time after that. She named her, privately, in her head, a name she never said out loud to anyone. She has never said it out loud to anyone since. The couple who received the baby were named Robert and Nancy Aldrich. They lived in a suburb of Memphis, Tennessee, in a house with a long driveway and a garden Nancy tended herself. Robert ran a small commercial real estate business. Nancy had taught elementary school for 11 years before her health made it difficult. They had been trying to have a child for most of their marriage. They were, by all accounts, decent people, warm, stable, the kind of couple that other couples looked at and thought, they'll be good parents. They had been connected to Pastor Gerald Whitmore for nearly 15 years. They had attended a church conference in Knoxville in 1973. Where Gerald had spoken, they had stayed in touch. Gerald had visited them twice in Memphis. He had, on one occasion, helped Robert navigate a zoning dispute through a contact he had in the county office. They trusted Gerald Whitmore completely. When he called them in the fall of 1987 and told them he knew of a situation, a young woman, a difficult circumstance, a baby that needed a good home, they said yes within a week. The paperwork was handled by Hargrove. This was not, in any legal sense, a standard adoption. It did not pass through the Tennessee or Kentucky state adoption systems. It did not involve a licensed adoption agency. It was processed on paper as a private placement, a legal mechanism that exists, but one that carries specific requirements, specific oversight, specific documentation. The documentation in this case had a problem. Among the forms filed was a standard welfare assessment, the kind required to certify that a placement meets the basic criteria for child welfare. At the bottom of that form was a signature. The signature belonged, according to the form, to a caseworker employed by the Kentucky Department of Human Resources. That caseworker did not sign it. She would later say she had never seen the document, that she had no record of the case, that the signature was not hers. Gerald Whitmore had been in the same Bible study group as her supervisor for 11 years. There was one other detail in the paperwork. A small box near the bottom of the primary placement form, under the heading Father. The box read, Unknown. Kevin Whitmore's name appeared nowhere in any document connected to this adoption. Not as the father, not as a party to the agreement, not anywhere. This was not an oversight. Years later, when Claire Aldrich began pulling at the threads of her own history, she would find a single document that made this plain. It was a handwritten note, 2 paragraphs, on Grace Covenant Fellowship letterhead, dated March 1988, 1 month before the baby was born. It was addressed to Hargrove. The relevant line read, Kevin has reviewed the placement forms. He confirms the father designation is acceptable as written. He will not be requiring any amendments. Kevin Whitmore was 22 years old when he wrote that he had reviewed those forms. He knew his name wasn't on them. He confirmed that this was acceptable. He signed off on his own erasure and on Linda's, with the calm of a man who had been taught very carefully that certain problems could be made to disappear if you handled the paperwork correctly. Linda knew none of this. She left Harlan County in October 1988, 6 months after the birth. She enrolled in nursing school in Lexington on a partial scholarship. She worked evenings at a diner on Limestone Street to cover the rest. She did not talk about what had happened, not to her roommates, not to the friends she slowly made, not to the man she eventually married. She carried it the way you carry something you have decided to carry. Not because it's light, but because you have determined that putting it down is not an option. Every April, on the same date, She got in her car and drove. Nowhere specific, just drove. An hour, sometimes 2. Then she turned around and went home. She did this for 33 years. Nancy Aldrich died in March 2020 in a hospice facility outside of Memphis. She was 71. Claire was with her at the end. In the last coherent conversation they had, Nancy had asked Claire to bring her a gray box from the spare bedroom closet. She had held it for a moment, then she had given it to Claire. "Not yet," she said. "When you find her. Open it when you find her." Claire had assumed Nancy meant if. It took her 8 months to understand that Nancy had said, when deliberately, because inside that box was everything Claire needed to find Linda Gaines. Nancy had known where Linda was for 33 years. She had never reached out. Hargrove had sent Robert a final letter when the placement was complete. It included, for reasons Nancy never fully understood, Linda's forwarding address in Lexington. She had given that to Claire instead. Claire spent those 8 months doing what she could before she got in the car. She filed records requests. She found a lawyer. She drove to Harlan County once and sat in the courthouse parking lot for 40 minutes before going inside. She found a woman named Donna Reeves in Bowling Green, whose story had a shape she was beginning to recognize. She did all of this before she knocked on Linda's door, because she needed to be certain, not for legal reasons, not for strategic reasons, because she was about to walk up to a woman she had never met and detonate something. And she wanted to be sure before she did that what she was carrying was real. She drove to Lexington on a Tuesday in November 2021. She parked 2 houses down. She sat in the car for 15 minutes. Then she got out, walked to the pale blue door, and knocked. Nothing happened for a moment. Then footsteps, a pause. The door opened. Linda Gaines was 53 years old, dark hair going gray at the temples. She was wearing a cardigan and holding a dish towel, the way people hold things they happen to be carrying, when an unexpected knock interrupted them. She looked at Claire with the polite, guarded expression you give a stranger at your door. Claire watched the moment it changed. It was the eyes. She had spent months looking at photographs of Kevin Whitmore, trying to find him in her own face. Mostly she had failed. Except for the eyes, she had always known something lived there that didn't come from the Aldriches. Linda's expression didn't crumble. It did something quieter and more complete than that. It simply stopped. The polite guardedness left her face entirely, replaced by something that had no name, recognition without context. The body knowing something before the mind has been given permission to know it. Her hand was still on the door. Claire spoke before Linda could find words. "My name is Claire Aldrich," she said. "Pastor Kevin Whitmore has been telling people you died in childbirth for 34 years. A pause, 1 second. "I think it's time people knew you didn't." Linda's hand tightened on the door, not to close it. She stepped back. Claire picked up her bag and walked inside. Claire set the folder on the kitchen table without ceremony. It was a standard manila folder, the kind you buy in bulk at an office supply store. Nothing written on the tab. Linda looked at it for a moment before she touched it. Then she opened it. The first thing she saw was a photograph. Kevin Whitmore, young, 21, maybe 22. standing in front of a truck she recognized, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. On the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, 4 words and a comma. The father, he knows, he agreed. She set the photograph face down on the table. The letters were underneath. There were 2 of them, both handwritten, both on the same stationery, cream-colored with a small printed header at the top. Grace Covenant Fellowship, Harlan County, Kentucky. Pastor Gerald T. Whitmore. Both addressed to Robert Aldrich. Both dated 1987. The first letter was largely procedural, Gerald explaining the situation, vouching for Hargrove, reassuring Robert that everything was being handled correctly and discreetly. The tone was warm, confident, pastoral, the tone of a man doing a favor for a friend and wanting credit for it. Linda read it without stopping. The second letter was shorter, 3 paragraphs. Gerald updating Robert on the timeline, confirming the expected birth month, providing a contact number for Hargrove, and then, near the end of the second paragraph, a single sentence. Linda read it once, then she read it again, then she read it a third time, her lips moving slightly, the way they move when a person is trying to make language behave like something other than what it is. The girl is nobody. She'll disappear. Kevin has a future. She tried to read it out loud. She couldn't. The kitchen was very quiet. Claire didn't say anything. She had read the letters months ago. She had already done whatever you do when you first read something like that. She sat across the table and waited. Linda put the letter down flat on the table. She didn't push it away. She just put it down and looked at it, as if looking away would mean something she wasn't prepared for it to mean. And then something shifted, not in her expression, not visibly, but somewhere behind her eyes, something moved. A piece clicking into place that had been waiting 34 years for the adjacent piece to arrive. She was back in that small office above the hardware store on Clement Street. 1988. Hargrove across the table. The papers in front of her. Her hand moving across the signature line because there was nothing else to do. Because the walls had already been built and the doors already locked. And the only variable left was whether she signed quickly or slowly. She had asked for a copy. Hargrove had said, standard procedure. She had looked down at the form before she signed it, just for a moment. There had been something, a detail that snagged briefly like a thread catching on a nail. And then she had signed, and the moment had passed, and she had not thought about that detail again. Not consciously, not in 34 years. The detail was a small box near the bottom of the page. Father, unknown. She had thought, at the time, that it was simply what they wrote when the father wasn't present. When the father had walked away, an administrative designation for abandonment. She understood now that it was not that. Kevin Whitmore had not simply walked away. Kevin Whitmore had reviewed that form, had seen his name was not on it, had written a note to Hargrove confirming that the designation was, in his words, acceptable as written. He had not been erased from the paperwork by oversight or bureaucratic indifference. He had signed off on his own erasure, which meant he had also signed off on hers. The girl is nobody. She'll disappear. That was not Gerald's assessment of what would happen. That was the plan. Linda's hands were resting flat on the table. They were not shaking. They had gone completely still. The particular stillness of a person who has moved beyond the point where the body expresses what the mind is processing, because the mind is processing something for which the body has no pre-existing response. Claire watched her and said nothing. Outside, the light was changing. Late afternoon going to early evening. The kind of gray that settles into your bones. It was November again. Claire reached into the folder again. She pulled out a single sheet of paper and set it on the table. It was a photocopy, slightly crooked, the edges soft from handling. A form, different header than the others, different county seal. Linda looked at it without touching it. "This isn't yours," Claire said. "This is someone else's." Her name was Donna Reeves. She had been 18 years old in the spring of 1991. She lived, at the time, in a small town called Middlesboro, 40 minutes east of Harlan County. She had grown up attending a church whose pastor had, for years, maintained a close relationship with Gerald Whitmore. Conference circuits, shared pulpits, the kind of professional friendship that exists in religious networks built on mutual referrals and mutual favors. Donna had found herself in a situation not entirely unlike Linda's. Young, unmarried, frightened. A pregnancy that the people around her had decided, quickly and collectively, needed to be resolved in a particular way. The attorney who handled her paperwork was Hargrove. The placement form listed the father as unknown. The baby, a boy, had been placed with a family in Knoxville, Tennessee. A family that attended a church affiliated with Gerald Whitmore's network. A family that had been, according to the records Claire had located, recommended directly by Gerald's office. Claire had found Donna after 4 months of searching. She lived now in Bowling Green. She had a grown son from a later marriage. She worked part-time at a garden center. When Claire first contacted her, Donna had not responded for 3 weeks. When she finally called back, she had spoken for 11 minutes. Claire had written down almost everything. Near the end of the call, Claire had asked Donna if she would be willing to speak to anyone else about what had happened. A lawyer, a journalist, anyone. Donna had been quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I was told the same thing you were probably told, that it was better this way, that it was the right thing, that nobody would believe me anyway." She paused. "I believed them," she said, "about the last part. For a long time, I believed them about that." She had hung up shortly after. She had not returned Claire's subsequent calls, but she had not, Claire noted, asked her to stop trying. Linda was looking at the photocopy of Donna's form. She was looking specifically at the small box near the bottom. Father unknown. Same box, same designation, same attorney, different woman, different year, different county, same architecture. This was the thing that changed the shape of what Linda was sitting with. A single act of cruelty, even a deliberate and organized one, can be understood, if not forgiven, as the product of a specific moment. A frightened young man, an overbearing father. A set of circumstances that conspired in one terrible season to produce one terrible outcome. But a pattern is something else. A pattern requires maintenance. It requires that the people involved make a choice repeatedly over years to keep doing what they are doing. It requires infrastructure. An attorney who files the same fraudulent paperwork twice. A network of churches that receives the placements. A system of silence that holds because everyone inside it understands exactly what they have to lose. Gerald Whitmore had died in 2015. He had been eulogized by 3 pastors and a state senator. His obituary described him as a pillar of his community. Kevin Whitmore had delivered one of the eulogies, and Kevin Whitmore, in November 2021, was still behind his pulpit every Sunday morning, still delivering sermons about grace and truth and the importance of living an honest life before God and man, still running his food drives, still meeting one-on-one with young men who had made mistakes, telling them the story of a girl he had loved, a girl who had died, a grief that had shaped him, a loss that had made him who he was. 1,200 people most Sundays, every Sunday. Linda pushed the photocopy back across the table toward Claire. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "How many?" Claire looked at her steadily. "I've found 2, she said. "I don't think it's 2. By Thursday of that week, Linda had made 2 decisions. The first was practical. She called the attorney Claire had referred her to, a woman named Patterson, based in Nashville, who had experience with fraudulent private placements and whose name Claire had written on a post-it note and pressed into Linda's hand before she left. Linda left a voicemail. Patterson called back within 2 hours. They scheduled a meeting for the following week. The second decision Linda did not tell Claire about. She didn't tell anyone about it. She found the church website on Friday evening. Grace Covenant Fellowship, Kingsport, Tennessee. The site was professionally designed. A rotating banner of photographs, the congregation, the food drive, a mission trip to Guatemala. Kevin shaking hands with a man Linda didn't recognize in front of what appeared to be a newly built community center. Sunday services at 9 and 11. Linda looked at the 11 o'clock listing for a long time. Then she closed the laptop, went to bed, and lay awake until approximately 3 in the morning. She drove to Kingsport on Sunday. It was a 2-hour and 15-minute drive. She left at 8. She stopped once for coffee she didn't drink. She parked in the back corner of the church lot, away from the other cars, and sat for 20 minutes before she went inside. The sanctuary was large, high ceilings, good acoustics, the kind of space that had been designed, consciously or not, to make a person feel small in a way that could be reframed as reverence. It was nearly full. She estimated 800 people. Maybe more. She took a seat in the last row, on the aisle. She kept her coat on. Kevin came out at 11:04. He looked older, obviously. 63 now, heavier than he had been. The dark hair she remembered gone entirely gray, but the voice was the same. She recognized it before she fully registered his face, that particular cadence, the way he dropped his volume slightly at the end of a sentence to make the room lean in. She had not heard that voice in 34 years. She sat very still and listened to it fill the room. He was 12 minutes into the sermon when he looked up from his notes, and his eyes moved across the back of the sanctuary in the way that a practiced speaker's eyes move, not looking at anyone specifically, covering the room, maintaining the impression of contact, and then they stopped. He found her in less than a second. She had not tried to hide. She was simply sitting there, in the last row, on the aisle, coat on, hands folded in her lap, looking directly at him. Kevin Whitmore stopped in the middle of a sentence. The pause lasted perhaps 2 seconds. To Linda, it felt considerably longer. To at least 2 people seated in the middle rows, both of whom would later describe this moment to Claire independently without prompting. It was noticeable enough to make them turn and look toward the back of the room, though neither of them knew what they were looking for. Kevin found the next word, continued the sentence, finished the paragraph, but his hands, resting on the sides of the lectern, were no longer steady. Linda saw that. She wanted to see that. The service ran until 12:20. Linda did not move for the entirety of it. She stood when the congregation stood. She sat when they sat. She did not sing. She did not bow her head during the closing prayer, though she closed her eyes briefly, not in prayer, but in the way a person closes their eyes when they are trying to fix a moment in their memory before it passes. The final hymn ended. The congregation began to move. Kevin stepped down from the pulpit, exchanged a few words with a man near the front, and then moved with quiet efficiency toward a door at the side of the stage. Not the main doors, not toward his congregation. The side door, the one that led, Linda assumed, to an office or a back hallway. He did not look at the back row again. Linda stood up. She smoothed her coat. She picked up her bag. She walked out the main doors with the rest of the congregation through the lobby where volunteers were handing out bulletins, and a woman at a table was selling somebody's self-published devotional out into the cold November air of the parking lot. She walked to her car. She sat down. She closed the door. She put both hands on the steering wheel. In her left coat pocket was a small digital voice recorder. She had bought it Thursday afternoon at an electronics store on Nicholasville Road. She had charged it that night. She had put it in her pocket Sunday morning before she left the house. She had not taken it out once during the service. She had not recorded anything. She looked at the church entrance through the windshield for a moment. People were still coming out, families, older couples, a man lifting a toddler onto his shoulders. Then she started the car and drove home. She got home at 3:47 in the afternoon. She hung up her coat. She put her keys on the hook by the door. She went to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment, looking at the table where Claire's folder had been sitting 4 days ago. Claire had taken it with her when she left. The table was clean. There was nothing on it. Linda's phone was in her hand. She thought about calling her sons, Marcus in Cincinnati, Daniel in Louisville. Good men, both of them. They knew their mother was private. They had learned not to push. She had not told them anything about Claire's visit, had said nothing about the folder or the letters or the drive to Kingsport that morning. She thought about calling them. She put the phone down on the counter. She went instead to the second bedroom, the one she used partly as a home office and partly as a storage room for the accumulated paperwork of a life. Tax returns, medical records, the boy's old school documents, her late husband's files that she hadn't been able to bring herself to go through completely. In the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, behind a folder of warranty cards for appliances she no longer owned, was a small address book, green cover. She had bought it sometime in the early 90s and had used it sporadically, updating it less and less as phones began to hold everything automatically. She flipped to the R section. The entry was in her own handwriting, in pencil, slightly faded. A name, J. Riley. A phone number with a Tennessee area code. and underneath, in smaller writing, a single line she had added when she made the entry. Reporter called about Whitmore. October 2013. Said call if I change my mind. She had never found out how Riley had gotten her number. She had asked that first call. Riley had said only that she'd been making calls, asking questions, following a thread related to the church's tax filings, a discrepancy in the nonprofit records, something that had seemed at the time like it might be the edge of something larger. The story had never run. Linda didn't know why. She had assumed, in the way she assumed most things related to Kevin Whitmore, that someone had made a phone call, pulled a lever, and the story had quietly ceased to exist. But Riley had called her, had found her somehow, had spoken to her for 22 minutes with a patience and a carefulness that Linda had not expected, had said at the end of the call, in a tone that was neither pressuring nor dismissive, "If you ever change your mind, I'm ready. Whenever you are, there's no expiration on this." Linda had written down the number. She had not thrown away the address book. She had not, in 8 years, asked herself why. She sat down on the edge of the bed in the second bedroom and looked at the number for a moment. Then she dialed. It rang 4 times. She was preparing herself for voicemail, composing the words, when the line opened. A woman's voice, careful, alert, the voice of someone who still answered unknown numbers, the way journalists do, with attention, because you never know. Linda said, "You called me 8 years ago. You said if I ever wanted to talk, you were ready." A pause, brief, the sound of someone sitting up straighter. "I'm ready now," Linda said. Pastor Kevin Whitmore delivered his sermon the following Sunday to a full house. Grace Covenant Fellowship, Kingsport, Tennessee. 1,200 people, give or take. He delivered another one the Sunday after that. He did not know, on either of those Sundays, that the call had already been made. He did not know that J. Riley had spent the intervening week pulling documents she had boxed and stored 8 years ago, when the story fell apart, spreading them across her kitchen table, cross-referencing them with the new material Linda had provided, and making calls of her own to 2 other women whose names had surfaced separately in the course of her original reporting. He did not know that Claire Aldrich's attorney had filed a formal complaint with the Kentucky Bar Association regarding the conduct of a now-retired attorney named Hargrove. He did not know that a woman named Donna Reeves in Bowling Green had on the previous Thursday returned a phone call she had been sitting with for several days and had spoken for 40 minutes and had, at the end of that call, said yes. Kevin Whitmore stood at his pulpit and spoke about truth. He spoke about the weight of secrets, about the freedom that comes from living openly, from having nothing to hide. The congregation listened. They trusted him the way they always had, completely and without thinking too hard about it. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.